Alrighty, everybody. We will get started here. Thank you for joining our second Ekstasis gathering, Ekstasis Ambassador gathering. We're super excited for the momentum that really has been gaining in the Slack channel and on Instagram and beyond. It's really wonderful to partner with all of you in your individual endeavors and your individual communities. And I'm so excited to see where this will go. So I know it's the mid-afternoon for most of you. Again, I am a little bit later behind all of you, but that's okay. We have a really special couple of guests that are going to join us today, and they bring a lot of the expertise and the hopes and dreams that I think a lot of us have for the power of storytelling in Christian community and beyond in the culture. So we're really excited to hear from them. But before we get to that, I would love to continue kind of building as cliche as it sounds, building a sense of community and getting to know each other. This isn't purely about Ekstasis to you. This is about you to each other and building the connections that lead to fruitful collaboration and fruitful partnership. So I have a few people who are going to give a very quick introduction of themselves. And we are still waiting on a couple more people to join, especially the speakers. But as they filter in, that's totally fine. So I would love for a few people that I have recognized through the years, through the development of Ekstasis. They've played a big part in its development and its growth and its characterization. So I'm going to call on some names. You can give me your name, where you are, what you do, and then just in general, what are you passionate about? And I know that's the most common question ever, but we just really want to hear the heart behind the people that are gathering with us today. So the first person on my screen that I see that I've talked to already, I'm going to ask Grace Pike. Tell us about yourself, Grace.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for waiting as I unpaused myself. I am so thrilled to be here. So thankful to see all of your faces. It's really sweet for me because I was sad to miss our first gathering. So grateful to meet all of you finally. I am really thankful to be part of this community and am just thrilled to be here because I am really passionate about just everything that this community represents. I think, I said it in my introduction and hope that it's evident in my writing, but just everything about nature, beauty, art, music. I think that just the way that God has chosen to gift us these things and allows us to see the threads that he's woven throughout common grace, gifts that he's given, and then allows us to be people who pull those things out and allow us to be good stewards of those things, to demonstrate them to others and kind of help others to see God and his glory shining through those things, and to help others see the magnificent and his splendor shining through those things. I think it's such a great gift. And so I think we see his beauty reflected in beautiful things. And then I also write a lot about suffering and sadness and darkness, but it's only because I believe in the hope of the resurrection. And I think that we see a lot of, new life through death. So really passionate about that as well.
Wonderful. And where are you from and what do you work? What field, what realm are you in?
Yeah, those things are important too, I guess. So I'm originally from Birmingham, Alabama. That's where I grew up and went to college. And then I moved to Kansas City, where I went to Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. That is where I got my Master of Divinity and where I worked as an associate editor for FTC, which is a resource called For the Church, and served as a writer there for the Spurgeon Library as well. and in their communications department doing social media, which was a great joy. And then I recently in March took a position in Colorado Springs, Colorado, which is where I live now, with the Navigators. So I'm working for their international office. So even though I work for the Navigators in the United States, most of my work is working with our international offices around the world. So yeah, stewarding our more international voice. And I really love that. And it takes me a lot of different places and allows me to connect with a lot of different people.
Wonderful. Thank you, Grace. That's awesome. That's super encouraging
Absolutely.
to hear. Okay, next up we have Catherine Ross. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and what are you passionate about?
Hi, I'm Catherine Ross. I am in Southern California, and I'm really passionate about storytelling. I just love stories so much, in various art forms. I am someone who really loves cartoons still because I feel like a lot of them just have some of the most amazing stories and story arcs that a lot of us would miss out on just because we're not the intended audience. What I'm thinking of is one of my favorite shows called Over the Garden Wall. I don't know if anyone's seen it, but it's amazing. It's on Hulu, perfect for this time of year. I saw it, I think in 2014, and I think that was when I kind of like really pushed me to see like stories are more than just, the old white writers you learn about in, college and high school. It's just so much more, so much beyond that. And that's not to say I don't love those same stories as well. I do. But I just am really passionate about storytelling. I'm really passionate about getting to the heart of just people and their connections, like why people do what they do, why they connect with who they connect with, and how things, Jonathan, yeah, and how they just, how they live out God's calling of creativity and connection and community. So I explore that a lot in my own writing. I do a lot of short stories and poetry, but I also write professionally. I'm a freelance writer. I have a small business where I work with clients to get their manuscripts ready for publication. And I also work on like copy, articles, things like that. So basically anything anyone needs, I like help them kind of copyright and copy edit that. And yeah, that's what I'm really passionate about. I feel like God has called me to create out of his creativity. I think he calls all of us to be creative out of his creativity. And so I love good stories and I want to write a lot of them too.
Hmm. Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, that both Grace and Catherine have published poetry with Ekstasis, and a couple more people that we'll introduce to tonight have as well. And we don't want to take too long on this, but just have anything percolating in your head after a few more introductions. If you've had a major win this month, something that you're super excited about, something to celebrate, and you want to share it, you can either just raise your hand or write to me in the chat, and we'll get to you after the introductions. We want to hear about what you're celebrating. Okay, so Chris Carter, you're up next.
Hey, my name is Chris Carter. Gosh, I can definitely give testimony to the power of the community that forms around Ekstasis. I read an article that Sean O'Hare wrote several years ago. Reached out to him on Instagram. We kind of kept in touch, but when I was visiting London earlier this year, we met up for a drink at a pub and just got to talk about faith and art and literature. And it was such an incredibly motivating conversation. But that's a connection I never would have made without having this platform here. So I'm very grateful for that. I'm originally from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Lived in Washington, D.C. for about 7 years and then moved out to Los Angeles 2 years ago. I won't tell you guys how close I am to the beach. But I'm a poet. I write short stories, and I do photography as well. So I'm just very passionate about the story that you can tell with those mediums, but also the just the sense of the moment that is passing and is very transient that you can capture with an image and with a story. It's just such a unique thing that you'll never see again. And just being able to memorialize that for a brief second for someone to see or read, that's something that's always really stirred my heart. And it just gives me a sense of the infinity that we'll see with God. Every moment's going to be so new and real with him, and we'll keep getting that over and over again, without end. So that's what I like to capture with my art.
Beautiful.
And that's all about me.
No, that's great. Thank you. That's wonderful. Yeah, Chris, you've been kind of around for a while in the Ekstasis world, so super thankful for your contributions in essays and poetry and photography. Thanks for taking the long haul with us. Okay, next up I have on my screen, Emily Bell.
Hey guys, so good to be here. I am in Newcastle, which is a small town about 2 hours north of Sydney in Australia. So it's pretty early. It's 6 a.m., but we're loving it. Yeah, I am a graphic designer. I've been working in the sort of non-profit and I guess small business space and in churches for the last 7 or so years. Yeah, so I'm super passionate about getting that sense of beauty back into the church, especially in a visual way. I don't know if it's the same everywhere, but here a lot of people undervalue that because it's just not always practical to, I guess, emphasize beautiful things at the cost of other things. So that's like my special sort of interest, which I didn't really realize until coming across Ekstasis and yeah, engaging with everything that you guys have been writing and sharing about. So yeah, and recently I've been doing more writing in the last couple of years, but sort of trying to slowly like refine that because it wasn't my initial thing, but I've really been enjoying it and reading everything that you guys share. So yeah.
Lovely. All right. One last introduction. When you're like hosting it, you don't know how long it feels to other people, so you can give me feedback later if this feels a little too long in the intro, but I'm loving getting to know you guys a little bit. Okay, we will go to Lily. Tell us about yourself, Lily.
Hi, everybody. My name is Lily Journey. I'm also living in Southern California right now, but true to my last name, I've lived a lot of different places in the Midwest and on the East Coast. I was recently in North Carolina working as a scriptwriter for the Samaritan's Purse podcast, but I'm back in California now. And I've been connected with Ekstasis for a few years now after a friend shared it with me, and had a piece of poetry published this summer. Something that I'm really fascinated by and passionate about is the intersections of beauty and I would say the truth of the church. I found that a lot of people in my generation are very, very cynical towards the institution of the church, and carry a lot of church hurt. And I think that a way to redeem that is just by observing the intersections of embodiment and our mundane lives, because I think that God really wants to use ordinary things to showcase his beauty. And the church, I think, returning to ordinary would be very redemptive. So in a lot of my writings, I explore just, those intersections between nature, art, social advocacy, and just the routines of everyday life. Right now, I'm working as a professional freelance writer. I also write articles and poetry just for fun, and work at a nonprofit in San Diego. So very busy, but I like to think a lot as well. And I'm sure a lot of you guys can relate to this, but I feel like I don't really know what I deeply feel or think about something until I write it, or design it. So I'm really excited to be a part of this community, and yeah, just I'm looking forward to hearing from more of you guys.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Well, that was super encouraging to me already. We can wrap it up now, technically. But I just want to say that I think what's super exciting about this community is that we are in the first stages of this next era of actually taking an online platform and making something of it relationally, communally, in person, forming those bonds. So I hope that most of you, if not all of you, got the little pin and card in the mail. That was Caroline's help. Caroline's husband, actually, if you were on the first call, he designed the original Ekstasis logo. And then we've been in touch, and Caroline's been a wonderful assistant editor. And so she sent that all out to you. Hope you enjoyed that. That's kind of the sign of the next stage of how we're going to move forward. We're going to create small cohorts of partner 3-person, 4-person writing groups, arts groups. And I just want to quickly say, I know that not all of you are writers primarily, and that's totally okay. We want artists of all kinds, designers, painters, poets, everything, filmmakers. We're going to hear from Erik later on, who's a filmmaker, Mike, who's a podcaster. But storytelling is the thread that weaves it all together. So yeah, whatever your medium, whatever your venue, we are so excited to partner together and strive to become even better at our craft, but also figure out ways to influence the small cultures around us, but also the wider culture as well. So I'm going to, and I'm a Zoom novice, so we'll figure this out. I'm going to say to Mike and Erik, can you turn on your video? And I'm going to find you, and then just start talking, and you'll come on my main screen here, and then we'll get to our main interview of the night.
Hey, how's it going?
Perfect.
You see
Hello,
me there?
Mike. Wonderful.
Oh, hey.
Awesome. And this is Erik. So I think I can put both of you on the spotlight for everyone. Okay, that's just Mike.
Just leave Mike. That's fine. Just have Mike on there.
All right, we'll run with that for now. So Erik and Mike are my colleagues at not Ekstasis, Christianity Today, which owns Ekstasis. And they have taught me so much, whether directly or indirectly. And I'm super honored that they'd come and speak to such a willing and eager and talented audience of people that kind of really get what we're all about at Christianity Today and Ekstasis. So I'd love for Mike and Erik to quickly just tell us a little bit about what your job is, what you're passionate about, and also, even if you could, cast a vision for what Christianity Today could mean to this next generation of storytellers. And then we'll get into a more formal interview, but just want to get to know you a tiny bit. Mike, you can go first.
Yeah, so I'm the director of media for CT, and essentially what that ends up looking like is I have a certain set of programs that I'm actually working directly on, helping to either produce or host or write for or develop in various ways. But then also working with Erik and with other members of our team to executive produce the other podcasts that we're making right now. We have other projects, other media projects down the line that are sort of in development, but nothing's really taken a lot of shape at this point yet for those. So I produced a podcast called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, and that was sort of a prototype for us of long form narrative storytelling. And we're in the process of producing the next version of that. I'm actually in Chicago right now because I'm working on that show, borrowing an office, sort of an abandoned, horrible office in a church for this call. And then on top of that, I contribute, regularly, semi-regularly to the magazine and the website, and I co-host the Bulletin with Russell Moore, which is our weekly news, issues, politics, culture show as well.
Beautiful. Erik, tell us about yourself and tell us about how Christianity Today can connect with this next generation. I'm going to change the spotlight.
Well,
I appreciate that.
Oh, wow. Oh, man.
Hello.
Gee whiz. Okay. So my job is simple. I am responsible to keeping Mike under control and to harnessing his genius. And I also have the responsibility of turning CT in a direction that is a little bit more appealing to a younger audience. And when Mike and I were talking through doing Mars Hill, one of our goals was to create an environment at CT as well as the world looks at CT in a way that was very different than the 65 years that it existed before. And our hope was not to do a smear campaign of anybody's life, but to identify some things that had been going on in the church for some time that many of you have experienced, I'm sure, that we didn't feel was healthy or even biblical. And our continued hope is that we will raise certain subjects up and deal with them appropriately in that same manner. So one of the new ones that Mike's working on, like he mentioned, is to do a very similar thing in identifying certain aspects of our culture that kind of led us to the situation that we find ourselves in today. So I do that. I also do a lot of other things in terms of help CT kind of grow its reach into filmmaking and television production, and where we've got a variety of things where we've been working on for a couple of years. And in that world, a couple of years is a short period of time. So we're moving in a direction that in the next year or two, we will have a couple of big productions that I'm working on. I can tell you about those in a minute.
Wonderful. Okay, this could be awkward, but I am curious. How many people have, number one, heard of Christianity Today? Number two, how many people listen to the podcast Rise and Fall of Mars Hill? It might not be that many, but I am curious. If you have, just raise your hand. Okay, we see if, wow, okay, okay, substantial. A lot more than I thought, actually. That's wonderful. And so Erik and Mike, you can take heart that it's resonating with a lot of, and what Lily talked about, especially church hurt and finding beauty in broken places. I think you're connecting with a lot of these people. So I'm super excited to hear more from you guys. That's wonderful to hear. Erik and Mike, you can take this however you want, and you can respond in whatever order you want. But I know that both of you have been storytellers for a long time. You've been involved in projects that span a wide range of mediums, contexts, and focal points. I know, Mike, you've written a couple books yourself. You've been in the publishing industry. Erik, you've been a filmmaker and a creative director in the commercial space, in the Hollywood space, in the indie film space. You've seen a lot of different creative environments, both on the commercial level, but also the deeply craft level oriented expertise creatives. What have you found in your life has been the thing that you've practiced and done on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis that has allowed you to flex the muscle, build the muscle to be able to, when the time comes, put on something like The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, which impacted millions of people? But what were the things that you did, that you practiced, that allowed you to be able to perform at that level when the time arose?
I'll just throw in a couple quick things. Yeah, thank you. That's the way you framed all that's very generous and kind, Connor. I think like the long-term lesson for me, both in whether it's writing books or writing articles or producing The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill or whatever it is, the long-term lesson for me has always kind of come back to the basics, which is that like to be, kind of the idea of that Stephen King talks about in his book on writing, that writers read a lot and they write a lot, and having consistent healthy rhythms. I mean, it's like a quarterback getting the right number of reps at a practice, or a band getting the right number of gigs or rehearsal to kind of keep at the top of their game, right? There's in a lot of ways, podcasting is there's a very writing heavy craft, certainly the way that we do it. It has been. And so kind of keeping the writing muscles moving is really important. And what I love about King's advice about read a lot and write a lot is that there's an aspect of the read a lot side that's about how do I fill the tank? How do I keep sort of fresh ideas, fresh metaphors, fresh language kind of moving through my system? How do I keep encountering different stories, different points of view? That's a really important aspect of it. But then the write a lot part is it's a strange thing, but there really is something to be said for knowing that I'm going to sit down every day and I'm going to get between 1,200 and 2,000 words out, and that's my output, and that reflects my job, and it reflects other aspects of my work. Some people it's more, some people's less, but what I find is if I get out of that habit, if I take a few weeks off of writing because it's not front burner for me because of what other projects or whatever, getting back to that is really, really, really difficult. So my big encouragement when I hear from folks who are like, how do I sort of break into a writing life or whatever, it's having those sort of core foundational disciplines of knowing how to get output onto the page, knowing what works for you, filling the well, what are the things that you can read that are going to make you want to write, or they're going to give you ideas the next time you go. That's all really, really critical.
Wonderful. Erik, I have a further question on that, but Erik, do you have a response as well or no?
Oh, I think the only thing I would say is watching Mike do what he did with Mars Hill was a perfect example of him living out what he's learned, whether it's in Stephen King's work on writing or any of the books that he's read or any of the classes that he's taught. He follows it really, really well. And I've appreciated watching Mike in his routines of writing, although sometimes they're manic. All night long was a common part of the Mars Hill experience we had. But I appreciate his advice to you because he lives it out, and I've watched him we've been working together for a long time now, and he really does live it. And it's hard to do. It's hard to put yourself into routine where it doesn't matter what those 1,200 to 2,000 words are. He's in it and at it. And I appreciate that about Mike a lot.
So you mentioned the all night kind of manic drives for not perfection, but excellence. And I find even with myself in the context of Ekstasis pre-CT and Ekstasis post-CT, Erik, you especially have helped me press into not being satisfied with good enough or what I thought was my limit. You're pushing me a bit beyond it. And that's actually necessary for great art. And I'm not saying this is great. I'm just saying that it's important. And what I've realized, you can put a cap on yourself so easily. And usually it requires some kind of a mentor or a boss or something else to put that pressure on you to actually go beyond what you thought your cap was. So I'm curious for this group who obviously with this Ekstasis Ambassador program, we're trying to create a mentorship kind of community, but a lot of people feel a little isolated in their craft building. They might not have the same pressure on them from a boss, but I am curious what your thoughts are, either of you, on how can you force yourself to go a little bit harder, to aim for excellence when you feel satisfied with where you're at now?
Well, that's a great question. I think the first thing that you've got to do is you've got to, I can't remember who said it, but it's a famous quote by a modern painter, and gosh, I can't remember who it was, but somebody asked him, if somebody wants to be a contemporary painter, and it might have been Jackson Pollock. and they said, if somebody wanted to become a contemporary painter, is there any point in going to art school anymore? Because, how much contemporary painting had changed and all of this. And he made a comment to the effect of saying, well, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what style you want to paint. In some sense, it doesn't matter if you go to art school or not, but you do have to wrestle with the masters, right? And what he meant by that is, regardless of where you're going to go creatively or what it is that you want to do or what your path is to getting there, you have to deal with the masters in the sense of you have to understand what made them great, and recognize that your work is in conversation with that work, whether you like it or not. And so I think that as writers, there's a lot of ways to do that. And I think I've been part of a writing group over the years, and I've loved that when that was a steady rhythm. And I've friends who've done the MFA thing, and it's a very similar kind of process in that sense. But I think that even without it, part of what that means for us is, as writers, is sure, you may not love, you may not want to write fine literature, you may not want to write whatever kinds of poetry or whatever, but you want to reckon with it. And so I think there's something to be said for, in the language I always use for the read a lot, write a lot. One of the language on the read a lot side that I always talk about is fill the well. Filling the well is it's not just reading, it's going to art museums, it's whatever it is that sort of stirs your mind, makes you think, makes you want to write, makes you want to create. That side of it has to be stretched and has to be challenged from time to time. It doesn't mean you can't fall back on watching Seinfeld reruns for the 900th time, because that has its own effect, right? But when there's challenging art that's come out, when there's a novel that's come out, when there's something that's important, or if there's books on the shelf that you're you feel this sort of nagging sense of I need to read this, I need to deal with it. It's worthwhile. And if you get, I'm also firmly of the opinion that if you get 30 pages into something and you're I can't stand this, don't force yourself beyond it. You've reckoned with it and you think it sucks, and you can move on with your life, But the other thing I think about it related to this is, I think it's Ira Glass who says this, that the quality of our work can only ever rise to the level of our taste. And so if we're not pushing our tastes to a certain level, if we're not encountering better and better art over the years, and if we're not reckoning with sort of the best of the best in the field that we're trying to do, our art's never going to transcend our ability to sort of know what's good. So, Erik.
Good words, Mike. Okay, so I have just a couple of thoughts on that. One is when I first got involved in film back in 1982, probably before some of you were born, I had this incredible blessing of getting to work with a great filmmaker named Peter Hunt. And Peter Hunt took me under his wing, and he had made a lot of great films in the 60s and the 70s. And he was a voracious feedback guy, and said, the only way you're ever going to do anything well is by getting lots of really good feedback. And so every time we worked on a 6-part miniseries on Raymond Chandler wrote about that famous detective, Philip Marlowe. And there were hundreds and hundreds of pages of scripts, and we would go through every single one of those things with a fine-tooth comb. I will say that when Mike was doing Mars Hill, it was very similar, and that's why we had a lot of late nights just working through, and you're getting information all the way down to the wire. But there was this feedback loop that was so important. And when I recently was out in LA and doing a thing for the film school out there, and I had a lot of young filmmakers asking me questions about, what do you think about this idea? And what do you think about that idea? And One of the things that I noticed is the ones I felt that were probably going to be most successful were the ones that were really asking questions. What do you actually think about what I've just done? And then just recently I spoke at Belmont College for their podcasting team. And all the students in the class pitched their idea to what they wanted to do. And it was interesting to see which ones actually wanted feedback and which ones didn't. And it's very rare that someone who doesn't want feedback is going to be very successful. And that's my opinion in terms of, that's what I've learned. And, you know, I'm not that much older than you all, but in the experience that I've had many times, and particularly with filmmakers that are trying to raise some money to make a short film, or even try to do their first feature, if they're not willing to take good notes on their script, there's not much hope. And so one of the things I would say that has made any of the successes that at least I've seen, and I would say Mars Hill is one of those, is that Mike was always open to solid feedback, direct feedback, and we have a good relationship that way. So I would encourage everybody to have somebody who's not going to mince words. It's such an important part of the process of creativity.
Right. Yeah, you touched on one element of concern that you might have with some artists or writers, and it's like, okay, these probably not going to go that far because they're not willing to actually push themselves and push further than they think. What, on a more general level for both of you, what is the thing that concerns you the most about the quote unquote creative industry, whether publishing, film, journalism, that Christians occupy today? And what can the next generation, all of us here, keep in mind to expand and also prune this sphere?
Mm-hmm. Gosh, that's such a big question. So I just gave a talk at this thing for the Center of Pastors and Theologians in Chicago, and one of the things we were talking about is sort of the general question of, like, with what's happened in the church in the last couple of decades, the scandals, the division over politics, all of the rest of it, like, what does moving forward look like? And one of the things that I talked about is the need for, like we talk a lot about deconstruction, we need to talk more about construction as well. What does construction mean? And to me, telling stories, making good art, making good films, that's all part of what we need next, right? And I've thought a lot about there was a Soviet dissident named Alexander Solzhenitsyn who wrote a number of memoirs about, you know, being imprisoned in the Gulag and what life was like under Stalinist totalitarianism, and he won I believe it was the Nobel Prize for Literature. He gave a really famous speech where he quoted Dostoevsky's idea that beauty will save the world. And what he described with that I thought was so great is he said, stories are this great lie detector. Like, literature is a lie detector in a sense, because if you're, for a story to work and to actually connect with an audience, it has to be true. If you're lying in a story, if you're writing propaganda, if you're trying to twist and manipulate, literature doesn't let you get away with it, because the story rings hollow, it rings fake, it reads like propaganda. And so for Solzhenitsyn, this idea that beauty will save the world was this idea that, like, whatever else is going on under totalitarian dominance, and in dark times, or whatever the circumstances are, telling truthful stories, telling them beautifully, telling them in compelling ways about human dignity, redemption, faith under oppression and suffering, that stuff is always going to ring true and cut through in ways that other ways of communicating and other acts of resistance just aren't. So I think, I feel like one of the burdens for us at CT and in CT media is figuring out, how do we tell beautiful stories, redemptive stories, truthful stories, that even in the ugliness of some of the details, nonetheless have that beauty and have that goodness that cuts through in a redemptive way, and bears witness to something better and more beautiful. So I think about that a ton, and I think that is the opportunity. I think that's a generational opportunity. We have to figure out, how do we amplify those voices, and how do we make room for that? And the fundamental thing being, tell it true, like tell the truth, and trust the truth to cut through in ways that are redemptive and ultimately.
I would add to that just a bit. Connor, do you mind if I add to that? Such good words. That's why Mike's so effective as a communicator. When we talk about truth and telling the truth, one thing that is important for you to consider as a writer, creator, designer, whatever, wherever you fall, is telling the truth is also, it goes beyond just what you see as true and what you've experienced as true in terms of things that have happened against you. One of the things that's so powerful are the people that are willing to deal with truth, where they are willing to say, this is where I've made a mistake. So a lot of times the younger generations thinks about it as, oh, I'm going to tell the truth, and this has been my experience, and this is how I was wronged, and that's fine, and that's part of the truth. But there is another side of that really brings it to a place to where it becomes this vulnerable authenticity, and that is, where have I perhaps gone wrong? What have I done or seen or whatever that creates an awareness in me that I didn't have before? One of the best examples that I can give you is when I think about the book of Jonah, and I think about this incredible story about a guy that makes the absolute most dumbass decisions you can possibly make in your life. And then he goes, hey, by the way, that was me. I wrote about myself. And just the power of that authenticity. A lot of times people forget the authorship of that book is Jonah. And if you were going to write a book about yourself, that probably wouldn't be what you'd choose. And so I think, just to add on to what Mike says about telling the truth, it's harder than you think to tell the truth. That's why very few people actually do it. Does that make sense? Is that fair to say, Mike?
Yeah, if y'all didn't, some of y'all may have noticed, and some of y'all may not have. We interviewed Harrison Scott Key on the Bulletin a few weeks ago, a couple months back, I guess now, and he teaches writing in Savannah, but he's also just a really brilliant memoirist, and he wrote a book called How to Stay Married, about the crisis in his own marriage almost falling apart. And the books are absolutely stunning, totally worth reading. And part of what makes them amazing is Harrison has this way of making you, literally in the span of a few paragraphs, just laughing as hard as you possibly can, and then just ripping your heart out with grief of that experience. It's remarkably great writing. And one of the things that we talked about in the interview was, we talked about how, I said, what was it like for you? Here you are, you've worked things through with your wife, and you're writing this book in which she's the villain. I'm not a spoiler alert. This is like what you discover in the first pages of the book. But you're writing this book in which she's kind of the villain, and yet you're in this together. And he goes, she is the villain in a sense, but also a big point of the book is that I'm the fool. And he says, if comedy is only, this kind of sort of truth-telling comedy is actually only comedy. It's only funny, and it's only compelling if you're the fool rather than if you're the hero. If you try to tell the story where you're the hero the entire time, that's really boring writing. It's really boring to read, and it's not believable. What makes, whether it's the Marx Brothers or Mel Brooks or whatever, and this is certainly true of him, what makes it great is that he knows the ways that he was foolish and stupid and made dumb mistakes and was insensitive to her and sort of created all of these errors on his own. So anyway, all that to say, I think when we talk about this truth telling kind of thing, that's a great principle to keep in mind, is that part of what we have to bring to the table is a depth awareness of our own naivety and foolishness, that can say, look, I bought into these things hook, line, and sinker, and this is what it wrought me and wrought those around me. That certainly continues to inform the way I think about, my concerns about what's happening with the church and politics and other things as well.
Which is a great way to bring full circle the story of Mars Hill. I think the reason why people responded so well to that story was because Mike's willingness to say, this is where we got it wrong, not just where Mark got it wrong, but where we got it wrong, and being very vulnerable about that. And I think that's what people felt. Then the church needs to be able to say, hey, we've gotten it wrong here and here and here, and just be willing to own that. And I think people would go back to church if that were the case. But a lot of times, as many of you know, the church is so worried about its image that it oftentimes isn't as transparent as it ought to be.
Yeah, and just even on the rise and fall, I was going to ask, and we don't have the time, but this concept of even esoteric truth, like truth that is not, obviously we want truth about ourselves, and that's what you guys are highlighting, but also the truth of reality, even far flung beyond ourselves, that is still true, such as the Bobby Knight story in the Rise and Fall, the fairy photography myth, and I can't even remember exactly what that was about, but just like this very far-flung mythological tale about fairies and catching fairies on film, and it was so true to them, and therefore it pierces our heart in a unique way, even though it makes no sense why it would. And my point, and I'm not the interviewee, but I'm in my European era right now, but I am reading a lot of like European literature from the 1950s to 1970s, and just about the living in wartime and all that stuff in Europe. And it's so far from my own experience, but I'm just pierced to the heart in such a unique way, that actually allows me to go beyond the purely therapeutic version of art, where we're just kind of plumbing the depths of ourselves, which is important, but we're also plumbing the depths of beyond ourselves and the human capacity, for all of us. So, okay, I want a couple minutes for people to be able to ask a question that they might have burning on their hearts. And we want to make as much time for that as possible. I try to keep this at an hour, so we have 9 minutes. Really quickly, before we get to people's questions, and think of it yourself, Erik and Mike, what, for this generation of storytellers, and often they're in professional capacities, but also hobby capacities. They are doing this for not fun, but they're doing this as a passion. How can we move from the place of hobbyism and pursuing it for its own sake, and maybe we get a Substack, maybe we start a little Instagram page, and that's all wonderful because that's the first step. And it's not about growing big, but how, for both of you, when the time called for Mike, you said, you know what, let's pursue the story of Mars Hill, and let's do it excellently, let's do it powerfully. And then it ended up blowing up in a way you didn't expect. How can we prepare ourselves? And you've already touched on it, but what's a piece of advice that you can give this next generation of storytellers to go from hobby to prepare for the big guns down the road?
Yeah, I think one of the big keys is actually just make yourself useful, right? And there's a couple of ways that I think that there's a couple of ways that I think that that can pan out. For me, I first started publishing as a writer around, I want to say it was probably 2006 or so, 2005, 2006. And it was right as the Gospel Coalition was getting started. It was it was very small website. My friend Colin Hansen was the editor. I had other friends that were involved on the board. And I knew I wanted to write, and I was like, what do you guys need? Like, what are you trying to do? What are you trying to cover? And they started talking about topics, and they were like, we've got some of these things covered. We really need somebody who's going to do some pop culture stuff for us. And I was like, oh, I can do that. Let me do that. And so looking for, one of the things to know is that like editors are often like part of editors' jobs is to have output, to have things to publish. And so befriending editors and saying, what do you need? What are the gaps? How can we help? Like, is there what can write, what kind of writing are you looking for your magazines, that kind of thing? That's actually a very good thing to hear if you're an editor, if there's somebody who's sort of eager to go, how can I be useful? The other thing I always encourage young writers is people often think about like when it's time to like, they want to write a book or they want to do whatever, they're like, I guess I need to go build a platform, right? Like I need to go build my social media following and all of that. And unfortunately there's something to that. Like having an audience helps. It's not the main thing, but it certainly does help. But having a network is in many ways more important. So getting to know writers, getting to be, getting connected, going to meetups. I think what you guys are doing here is a great way to do that. Calvin University has a Festival of Faith and Writing. That is a pretty incredible hub for getting to know writers and editors and kind of understanding the Christian publishing world. So I encourage you to be a part of that. And again, what people often do is the mistake they make is they show up in any creative industry and you go to somebody who's a gatekeeper and say, how do I get past you? As opposed to, how can I be useful to you? What is it that you're needing that writers can either help you with or whatever? And then the last thing is be a cheerleader for writers and good writing. One of the funny things that I discovered sort of by accident is that there were writers and filmmakers and different people who over the years that I just really loved, and I just kind of made it a point to with a couple of podcasters, for instance, I made it a point every time I loved something that they did, I tweeted about it or I posted about it on Facebook or whatever, and then one day, months down the line, I had been pushing one particular show, and the host of the show reached out to me and was like, hey, I really appreciate that. You've really helped. You've directed a lot of people to the show. Thanks for that. I'd love to know more about you. We developed a friendship. He's been a mentor of mine in many ways ever since then. I don't think that would have happened had I shown up on his doorstep and said, will you mentor me? And it wasn't a manipulative thing on my end where I go, maybe if I do this, I'll get something out of it on the back end. I want to be a blessing to somebody. I want to cheer on other people's work. And there's a way that, I don't know, what does it Sting says? You send love out into the world and the world sends love back, something like that's probably true.
Awesome. Erik, any last words before we go to questions? Okay. Yeah, and I can just affirm what Mike's saying. On the editorial level, we see your names, even at a publication as big as Christianity Today, but a lot smaller, such as Ekstasis. You don't realize how much that small encouragement on the readership level actually goes to partnerships down the road. So yeah, I definitely can affirm what Mike's saying there. And again, we don't want to make it all about writers. Like Mike's obviously in that sphere. a lot of writers are here, but whatever medium you're in, I think a lot of the same principles apply. So we can definitely learn a lot from that. All right, we have a couple minutes left. I would love to hear a few of your questions. I'm sure even if you're shy, you might not be willing to be the first one, but I'd love for a bold person, go for it, raise your hand, unmute yourself, ask Mike and Erik. This is your one chance to ask a question. Media, storytelling, faith, publishing, whatever. We'll leave the floor open for a couple seconds, couple minutes. Okay, Michelle raised her hand. I think that means, okay, go for it, Michelle.
I think iPhone 104 has his hand up as well. Whoever that is.
That's fine, go for it.
So the question that you're asking us to ask, what are you interested in reading? What do you need written at this point for Christianity Today and or Ekstasis?
Go for it, guys.
Go for it, Erik. I've talked too much already.
It's a really good question, Michelle. I think a lot of times it's more an issue of what do you think needs to be written, and then you pitch it. I think it starts there a lot of times. And I think as much as the question is a valid one, I think, well, how do you see what's your perspective on whatever it might be, whether it's the war, whether it's the House of Representatives, whether it's culture, just taking a stab at and making pitches, pitching, whether it's film, whether it's a creative idea, whether it's a podcast, whether it's a story, pitching is a great habit to learn how to do. And that's one of the things that you have to do, whether you want to write an article for the Washington Post or for Christianity Today, or you're going to try to pitch an idea for a short film. But what I would say is, look, pay attention to what's going on, and then say, well, what's my perspective? And then give us a pitch and say, this is what I'd like to write about. Then that's a good place to start. Would you say, Mike? Is that a fair?
Yeah. There's a great, and I feel like she's published this online somewhere, but Alyssa Wilkinson, who used to write for CT, she now writes for Vox, has done posts somewhere. Maybe it's on her Substack. Maybe it was a Twitter thing. I can't remember. I imagine if you Google it, you'll find it because it's been shared a lot. But Alyssa Wilkinson has a great thing on how to pitch and what goes into a pitch. When I think about pitching places, I mean, in CT, it's a little different because I have an inside track. I know people, but when I'm pitching someplace that isn't CT, what I understand editors often want is give them the punchy headline, give them the 2-3 sentence deck. And then I always go back to like Hitchcock's three act structure as like kind of the like for anything I write, I try to think in terms of the 3 act structure. Hitchcock would always put it as proposal, argument, conclusion. So it's like, here's what people think. Here's my counterintuitive idea that I'm going to push against what people think. And then the conclusion is I'm going to answer objections and tell you why I'm right. And so I try to put that together in a handful of sentences, less than 100 words, when I'm pitching outside of CT. So title, deck, and then 100 words that does proposal, argument, conclusion. And usually if I can't do that, it means that my idea is only half baked, or not even half baked, and not ready to pitch.
Yeah, and even just going back to what Erik said about what do you think should be written about, I think with Ekstasis especially, we love to see countercultural kind of things that might not be pitched at a major outlet, but are a unique and passionate storytelling endeavor. And one example of that on the Christianity Today level is this new podcast executive produced by Erik. I'm not sure if Mike was a part of it, sorry. But it's called Be Afraid, and it is a horror-focused podcast Obviously, we're in October, so there is a little bit of a hoof, but it really goes deep into the horror genre in a way that you wouldn't expect a Christian publication to do, but it brings out so many threads of our humanness, our fears, what we should fear, what is real, what isn't, how entertainment plays into it. So definitely encourage you to check out the podcast. And it's just a great example of something off kilter that you might not expect, but actually resonates deeply with a lot of us. I've never watched a horror movie in my life, but it's definitely very entertaining. All right, Analia, I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name right. Thanks for your question, Michelle. Analia, you can go ahead.
Hi,
Or
yes.
Analia.
I'm Analia, yeah. So I'm a young Christian writer, and something that's troubled me over the years that I've noticed is that there seems to be a real lack of a robust Christian literary scene. This is partly why I'm so thankful for Ekstasis and their work. But most notably in terms of like just novel writing, like the only thing that I really know of that exists in the Christian literary scene today is some like romance novels. I don't know, but that's not really like the robust Christian literary scene that used to exist. So I was wondering if either of you had recommendations so that I could better immerse myself into the Christian literary imagination.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot more Christians writing literature than we might give them credit, but they're not writing Christian literature and they're not publishing to Christian audiences. One of my favorite examples of this is Brett Lott. Brett runs the writing program at the University of Charleston and has written, gosh, I don't know, 12, 15, 16 books, something like that over the years, probably more than that at this point. Including two really, really great books on writing. Letters in Life is a wonderful memoir of the writing life. He's got another one, I think it's called Before You Start, that's also really good. And then he wrote a novel called Jewel that became an Oprah's book club selection and it won several literature prizes. And it's just phenomenal. And he's just a deeply devout person, and the writing runs all the way through it. There's a writer who she teaches University of South Dakota, I think was where she last was, named Gina Oshner, Oschner. She's one of my favorite writers as well. But again, deeply informed by faith, but not writing to Christian audiences. Obviously, I think what Connor is doing with Ekstasis is bringing some great voices out. Image Journal is always worth keeping an eye on for the short fiction that they publish. There's, some truly magnificent poetry stuff coming through Image that crosses over as well. So it's there. What Brett would say, and what Brett talks about a lot, is that you kind of end up with this, the way markets work, right? You kind of end up with like, okay, there's literary fiction, which is a smaller audience than fiction generally. There's Christian fiction, which is a smaller audience than literature, sort of trade paperback sales generally. And so if you want to be a Christian literary fiction writer, you've really, really sort of narrowed down your potential for an audience to something very, very small. So usually people sort of lean one way or another. You make a lot more money writing Amish fiction and selling it to Christians than you do trying to write literary fiction. It's just the facts. Those Amish fiction books sell like candy. People love them. And there's, it has its place in the world. So, but I think that's why it's a little different now. And Brett would acknowledge this as well. The academy can be a hostile place for Christians, and literary writing lives and dies in the academy. So it makes it's one of the reasons why people don't quite wear their faith on their sleeves, at least until they've reached a point where they're old enough to have tenure and can't be fired anymore, like Brett. So.
Great question. And secretly, my long-term goal that I will not be able to accomplish is to create an economic engine for Christian literary fiction, explicitly, but also in a intelligent and creative manner. Okay, Avra or Abra.
Hey, good afternoon. It's Abra. Mike and Eric, you referred to the church today quite a few times, like the church telling the truth and the church needing. I'm just wondering, which denominations are you particularly thinking of when you use that term?
Yeah, I would say I definitely I'm a big tent evangelicalism guy, and so I definitely think really broadly by that. I think when I think the church, I'm thinking about the witness of and the presence of, you know, again, sort of broadly evangelical convicted churches. So generally what I'm thinking is like, what does Protestant Bible believing Christianity, how is that reflected in them? And so that's like, you know, in North America, that's Baptists, but that includes a lot of Pentecostals and it includes a lot of Presbyterians and that kind of thing. But it's, I mean, you know, it's tricky because there's very devout Catholics that are artists and that are contributing from a place of faith. I'd include the witness in there as well. So I think maybe the best way to put it would be to say when we talk about like the witness of the church, we're talking about people who are wearing their faith on their sleeves as they go about their work, whether that's in politics or the arts or whatever else. That's what's in mind for me.
Same for me. Well said.
Super helpful. Thanks, guys.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, just a quick question. I know we're over time. We have a few more questions. Eric and Mike, are you good for like 5-7 more minutes?
I've got about 5, yeah.
All right, great. Lily, go ahead.
Okay, I'll keep this really brief, but question about process, especially in long form journalism. How do you know when you're done? Because usually when you keep digging into something, more and more comes up. And sometimes it feels dishonest to cut something off and not explore it more deeply. So is that kind of an intuitive sense, or how do you know when to be done?
Mm-hmm. I know I'm done when Erik says it's time to publish. So that usually helps for me. No, I think like one of the things that I'm the most grateful for in the process of making The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, like we were really understaffed for that. We were really in way over our heads on a really big story. And it was a great experience. But you know, there was a lot of pressure from the outside and there was pressure from the inside to go, keep publishing, keep the thing moving on, release on schedule. And the option we had, because we had people coming out of the woodwork and like, it was like, we can keep reporting and we can get a better story out of this if we give it more time and we give it more episodes and we give more time on the, I mean, we had some like 3.5-hour episodes. It was obnoxious. But Erik and, you know, there were some other voices inside CT. One of our former editors, Ted Olson, was one of them who was very, very hardcore about this, just saying, you got to give it time. And Erik as well, you got to give it time because you've got to tell the story. And it's better to get it right and for it to come out late than for it to be rushed and wish you'd said other things or done other things or whatever. Like once it's out there forever. You can't really roll it back. So there's definitely something to that. That said, I mean, the amount of detail in the story that made it to the cutting room floor, right? Like the aspects of the story that we didn't get to tell. There were things, you know, I was just talking to somebody who's a pastor in LA. Like there's a whole saga of Mars Hill, Los Angeles that we never even mentioned on the show. That was the ultimate trajectory for where the church was headed in the final year, and that never came into being. That's a fascinating story that we didn't tell. And it was one of those things where we just had to go, yeah, it's not, it doesn't work. Like it doesn't fit. And so, you know, the old Hemingway quote, you know, kill your darlings. It's really true. Like a big part of great storytelling is figuring out how much of this can I gut out of it to make it as lean as possible, and to keep it what's John Gardner's word, profluence. Great writing has profluence, right? The way you can have profluence in your writing is that you get all the junk out of the way and you keep it moving as much as you possibly can.
Wonderful. All right, very last question. We got Faith. Take the floor.
Hey guys, sorry if you can't hear me clearly. I'm coming from a very busy cafe in Brooklyn. But I am a very much like level 1 visual artist. I'm not a writer. So I feel like I'm a little outnumbered in this meeting. But I don't have any educational background. I did not go to school for this. I've been painting for 2 years. And Mike, when you were talking about making ourselves useful, as a visual artist tending to be kind of a one-man job, how can I make myself useful in the visual art space? And seek mentorship and critique while still maintaining the sanctity of my process?
Great question. So I, for several years, ran a gallery in Louisville, Center for the Arts. We had a couple of galleries, contemporary art stuff, and it was really, got to know a lot of artists and got to see a lot of artists work their way kind of through the process where they, you know, going from showing in group shows to individual shows and then making it beyond us into better and bigger things. So a couple of things I would say. One is get into the scene, right? Like know when the art galleries are doing their openings, and just be a presence and make sure that you understand like what's happening in your local community. Where are artists gathering? What are they making? What are they talking about? What is the art talking about? Look for opportunities to volunteer. I think that's kind of similar to like when writers are thinking about like I want to be useful to an editor. Like, one thing is like if you've ever hung a show at a gallery, it's a miserable job hanging a show. Hang out at galleries, go to the openings, meet an owner, and just say, hey, the next time you're hanging a show, do you need some help? Do you need somebody just to hold a ladder or hold a level or whatever? I'm available. Looking for things like that. Be useful, be of service, be around. And what I found is that, again, like that, those little acts of generosity tend to open doors where when the opportunity comes and you go, hey, I've got 20 pieces of art in my studio and I'm trying to figure out what do I do next. Like, do I have a show? Do I have work? What's working of what I'm doing, whatever. Once you've kind of built some of those friendships and relationships, you're going to have some people in that network where you can go, can you speak to this? And they'll come and they'll take a look at what you're doing and say, hey, this idea right here, this is really singular. Like, do 20 more of these, you know? And then that's the kind of stuff that makes a big difference for an artist I've seen over the years.
Unreal. Good job, everybody. It's a little overtime, so I'm not going to draw this out. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming. And it's definitely filled my soul. I'm sure it's filled your soul to a certain extent. Thank you, Erik and Mike, for being so generous with your time. And I know you've encouraged a lot of people here. Keep a lookout for emails and on the Slack channel. Super excited to continue this journey with you all. And we'll stay in touch. All right. God bless everybody. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.